Now that we've established what language is, how we acquire it, stages we go through, and what parts of the brain might be responsible for producing language, let's look at some of the purposes or potential purposes for language. So, when we're using language, we're typically trying to communicate thoughts, ideas, and feelings, or we're trying to facilitate social communication. Or maybe we're trying to connect abstract concepts to the world. All three of these different purposes are extremely important in our daily lives. And we might even go so far as to say that these are all involved in some of the aspects that make us uniquely human. Before we spend more time talking about what language can do and what we can do with it, let's start talking about how we might store some of this information. So first we're going to talk about the concept of the mental lexicon. And so a mental lexicon is the storage of words and related concepts. So as you can imagine, with all of the words that we would need to know to communicate abstract thoughts, to get across feelings and sort of things that might not be easy to describe, we tend to have a pretty extensive vocabulary. And humans in their memory can store between 50 and 100,000 words. So 50,000 and 100,000 words. And in terms of rate, we can retrieve between 2 and 4 words per second from that massive memory store that we have. So how do we organize all these words to be able to find what we need very quickly and produce it out loud or on paper or however? Well, and that's where this mental lexicon comes into play. So this is the idea where we store words adjacent or nearby to other words that are related. And we also tend to store in the same basic area the relationships between those words. So the words that are similar to one another, the relationship between those, all of that gets stored in this web or net of thoughts and ideas. So what exactly is our mental lexicon constructed of? We're going to sort of think back to some of the structures that are involved in language, where we had already talked about our phonemes and morphemes, and how phonemes build up to make morphemes, morphemes add together to form words. Within the mental lexicon, we don't have to go any further than words. We don't have to worry about phrases or sentences that we already talked about in terms of our hierarchy. But here, our mental lexicon is going to include sort of the letter and sound syllables that are involved in our phonemes. So we would associate things that sound similar, sort of close together. So flea, tree, pea, glee, they all rhyme, they all have similar sounds, so they might be more closely associated in this network. With morphemes, if you recall, these are the smallest unit of language that actually have some meaning to them. So in addition to our root words, we can look at things like prefixes and suffixes, and those would again be associated by similar meanings. So here we'd have next to each other things like anti, meaning before, and trans, meaning across, so relationships directionally. And the third type of things that we might organize together are based on semantics, and those are the meanings of words. So we might see book, novel, tome, and essay all stored in the same area because they have similar meanings. This image here is an example of how our mental lexicon can sort of organize ideas together into this network of stored information that lets us interpret words or individual words in the context of other related words. So in the middle here we have a bunch of color words, red, white, and black. And then we have things that associate sort of very closely with those. So if we think about red and white, maybe we think about roses. Or roses are flowers, so they associate with daisies, and daisies are also white. So these points that connect to one another are sort of similar shared meanings or shared sounds or some kind of relatedness there. Now, it might be a good idea to keep in mind that with these mental lexicons, these aren't physical structures. This isn't necessarily, say, a set of neurons that are connecting in a particular way. We're talking more about abstract concepts that seem to be stored in a way that they activate together. In truth, we don't really know how these concepts are stored at a very detailed cellular level, but this is sort of our best explanation of how the concept seems to work. Similar to that idea of concepts that are closely related being associated more closely, we can start looking at things like category membership, which will then lead us into talking about how we classify objects. But the idea here is that if we want to decide if something fits into a particular category, there are usually a set of characteristics that seem to be related to that category. So if we have our category in question is bird, and we have some defining features of that category. So birds typically have feathers, they can typically fly, they have wings. We can then look at different examples of birds and decide if they fit into that category. So robins, they have feathers, can fly, and have wings. So we have a much stronger connection between bird and robin because it has lots of connections with those defining features. And we would have, say, a weaker connection between bird and ostrich because an ostrich has feathers and wings but cannot fly. So there are less connections to those defining features of being a bird. So ostriches are less connected to the category of birds. And there are other factors that these sort of ostriches would have or robins would have that they don't necessarily share with one another. So these are just related concepts or features of those particular things that we're thinking about. And we're deciding whether they sort of define that category or if they are characteristic of each individual thing that we're trying to categorize. And as promised, this leads us to the idea of classifying objects. If we're classifying an object as belonging to a particular category or not, we have to use different things to make that judgment of whether or not they belong. So one of the theories that we can use for classifying objects is the theory of family resemblance. So this says that object classification is dependent upon connections and representations. So kind of like what we just saw here, with different defining features or individual characteristics. So under this theory, we can decide how we want to classify a particular word or how we're going to classify a particular object, determine its meaning based on how it overlaps between other things that we know about. So the idea here is when we're faced with an object or an item that we don't know anything about, we kind of use these rules in our minds to allow us to decide how we're going to consider it. So maybe we see a bird. We see like this bird down here on the left-hand side. And so we might know that that's a pigeon, not because we have seen this exact image of pigeons before, but because it has the general shape and size and color that we've seen before with pigeons. So it fits that family. We could classify it as a family based on our prior experience. Now, depending on what part of the world we're from, it might be very rare to actually see, say, white pigeons. So they lack that distinctive coloring that we might associate with pigeons, but they're still the right size and shape, so we would probably feel fairly comfortable calling it a pigeon, even though the colors are wrong. So we've decided that these birds count as the family of pigeons. They fall under that category based on other features, even though they don't hit every single characteristic that we might associate with pigeons. Now, the benefit of using something like this, one of these sort of mental shortcuts, is it saves us from having to sort of manually and exhaustively compare an item that we're looking at, sort of item by item, to every other bird that we've ever encountered. Instead, we use the general rule of pigeons tend to look like this, and we can slot that new image in with the rest of the pigeons because it sort of ticks enough of those boxes. And that vague mental image that we get when we think of pigeons, that we could call that a prototype. And this is the most common or typical form a word assumes when we imagine it. So when we think of pigeons, we think of something sort of generally that color with that sort of shaped eyes, that sort of shaped body, pinkish feet. That's what we envision as pigeons. So that's the prototype that we compare any new pigeon-esque birds towards. And that's what we would use to decide if a new bird counts as a prototype. Or counts as a pigeon. I'm sorry, we compare it against the prototype. Another example that does not involve birds can be using this sort of abstract shape setup. So if we have here a theoretical prototype member, so this is our sort of most common or typical form of this group. So this is how we're going to decide if different things belong in this group. This is our comparison that we have to consider everything against. And so if we look at all of our options, we have 4 different shapes here, and we have to decide which ones of these are group members. And so we can use different ways to evaluate this. We might be pretty confident in saying that the circle is a member of that group because the prototype member is also a blue circle. Our example circle doesn't have the squiggly lines, but the shape is right and the color is right, so maybe that's enough characteristics to belong to that group. We might also say that, okay, well, the star is the right color, but it's the wrong shape and it doesn't have squiggly lines. Is that part of the group or not? Or how about the green square? That's the wrong color and the wrong shape, but it has the squiggly lines. Is that one trait enough to be part of the group? And then we have our gray triangle, which is the wrong color, the wrong shape, and doesn't have squiggly lines. So we'd be pretty confident saying that this one is not part of the group. So we can decide, based on sort of how many traits we're looking at, all those characteristics, does this belong in a group or not? And with real life examples, we'll have sort of more than just shape, color, and squiggles to judge membership on, but this is a good thought exercise to sort of think about the process that we might use to classify objects. Now we get to start talking about some of the really cool ideas. So we're going to look at how there might be a connection between language and culture and how we classify different items. So this is going to be the sapphire-wart hypothesis. And this is a theory that says that the structural differences in a language can alter one's perception and understanding of reality. So we might also call this linguistic relativity, but the idea is that different languages sort of organize information in different ways. So we might have more words to describe certain things, or we might talk about relationships between items in different ways. And this theory basically says that the organization that's involved in the language can influence how we see the world because it sort of sets up a structure in our minds for how we interpret that information. Now, that's a little bit out there in terms of concepts, but let's walk through an example and see if that helps solidify what they're getting at with this idea. So for this example, we're looking at an experiment that was conducted using Russian speakers and English speakers. Now, in Russian, they have more words that describe the color blue. So they have a lot of ways to distinguish between sort of light blues and dark blues, and they have lots more ways to sort of divide up the color blue. Whereas in English, we kind of talk about blue, light blue, dark blue, and that's kind of it. And so in this experiment, they presented the participants, either Russian speakers or English speakers, with colors. So they would be presented with a sample color. So they're shown this color, that color goes away, and then they're shown two other colors and asked, which is closer to the color that you just saw? And what they found is that Russian speakers showed a significant advantage at categorizing the sample color and the comparison color. So they'd recognize that these two were the same color a lot more frequently than native English speakers would. Now, this doesn't mean that our language completely changes how we perceive the world. It's not likely to be a drastically different sense of reality or perception, but there is more and more evidence that the differences in sort of structural organization of language might also be mimicked in some of our thought patterns. So things like attention, memory, reasoning, or perception of colors seem to be influenced by how we sort of think about those concepts. So it's not that the English speakers here were failing to perceive the difference between those colors, but that the Russian speakers benefited from having extra categories to sort of compare against while performing this task. There are also some other interesting things we might want to make note of for differences between languages. So, for example, if we talk about things like directionality associated with concepts, so English speakers might say that when you're talking about time, it's sort of a horizontal reference. So you put the past behind you, or you look ahead for a journey. Whereas individuals that speak Mandarin would use a vertical reference. So Monday would be upward, whereas Friday would be downward. And so those sort of different framing ideas gives us a different perspective on different elements. And this is another one of those things where as we learn more, we're realizing that there seems to be more and more effects. And it might, again, it's not necessarily some dramatic, massive shift in how we perceive the world, but it does have an effect on how we interact with the world.